Welcome back to Sector Report. I'm David Beatson. This week, the battle for ownership of the controversial Crayfor farms goes to a second round. What will Chinese bidders Shanghai Pengjin do now? And why the Kiwi country doctor may be our next endangered species.
I think if the organisation hadn't been set up a few years ago, I'd hesitate to think where we would be now.
Well, members of New Zealand's Rural General Practitioners Network will meet the Minister of Health at their annual conference next month, hoping to hear some good news. For years they've been warning health authorities that the rural medical workforce is ageing, that new graduates aren't willing to consider rural practice, and being on call 24/7 and travelling long distances to see patients in remote areas imposes its strains on the GPs and their families. They've been promised a review of the funding system for rural medical services, and the results are now due to be released. So it seems like a good time for our rural affairs correspondent Drew Chappell to check out a day in the life of a country GP.
I've been here for 21 years now in rural New Zealand, and I'm still here and I'm loving it. I live in paradise.
If everyone shared Dr. David Wilson's opinion, New Zealand would never face a shortage of workers in any field.
Kevin, have you taken your medication this morning? Yeah, great.
The picture of rural medicine in this country, however, is not quite as attractive as our natural landscape.
Take the blue one as you need it. Yeah.
Long hours, stress, and a shortage of qualified workers are just some of the challenges facing doctors in the country's most remote areas, and it's quickly becoming a crisis.
For us, it's a constant struggle to make sure we have enough doctors in rural practice. So just to give you an idea of the state of play right now, we have got 43 permanent vacancies across 39 general practices across the country, and four of those practices have actually got 2 vacancies.
Attempting to keep qualified doctors like Michelle Thompson in remote areas is a challenge, especially with so many better options elsewhere. New Zealand simply can't compete financially with larger countries, especially not at the so-called grassroots.
One of our biggest challenges really is getting them to bypass Australia because the terms and conditions are so much better. What we have in our favour is to sell the Kiwi lifestyle. The money is sort of on the bottom line of acceptability for them. There's always upward pressure from the locum's perspective about the hourly or the sessional rate they're going to get paid. But of course it approaches the maximum end of what a rural general practice can actually afford to pay.
But even tougher than keeping our own doctors in our rural towns is attracting qualified immigrants. When Kiwis follow the call of the dollar elsewhere, our rural GP network kicks into action, seeking out either short-term locums or permanent residents to fill the vacancies.
We treasure our locums and we try and stay in touch with them the whole time they're in New Zealand or if they settle permanently. Very precious, and we're starting now to have quite a bit of repeat business, which is wonderful, and they're like hen's teeth and we really look after them. It's wonderful that they come.
One of those who has heard the call and come running is Canadian doctor Lois Bowden. She's looking forward to the challenge of working in a general practice in Masterton.
I think it's an ability to interact with people on more of a continuity level and to get to the roots of family practice, general practice you call it here, and to work with health prevention rather than just kind of suturing or treating things in an acute basis. You get to do a little more planning and health prevention, and that's always really rewarding.
Lois reckons there's one thing that will keep people like her coming back, and it's nothing to do with money.
It's the incredible country that you have. It is absolutely stupendously beautiful. People are tremendously friendly, and ability to work with us and to take newcomers like us on board and kind of help us learn the ropes. I think your healthcare system has many attributes that we still strive for in Canada. You have interwoven the private and the public system in a much better fashion than we have been able to, and your inclusion and interweaving of your Aboriginal Maori culture with your European culture is working much better than ours is as well.
And sometimes the visitors fall in love with the place and decide to stay too. The Mercury Bay Medical Centre here in Whitianga is around an hour and a half away from the nearest surgery, over in Thames. And with a service base of more than 4,000 people, it's perhaps the most remote practice of its kind in the country. Dr. David Beatson came to New Zealand 21 years ago after an already adventurous career which started in London and continued in Papua New Guinea. He says our country is both beautiful and challenging, professionally and personally.
Here you've got long distances between towns and where people live, and so we have to cope with that, and we have to be, I think, much more active in many of the things we do than they have to be in England. I may be being rude to my friends over there, but I think that's what we got.
And working in a small town like Whitianga also throws up some unusual challenges.
Yeah, you get waved at in the street and in the supermarket. I don't have too many people showing me their skin moles in the middle of New World, but I mean, I dare say it happens from time to time. That's fine by me. It doesn't worry me at all. I know of some people who don't like it, but I have never been embarrassed by the situation.
As a doctor, you're not likely to settle down in a place like Mercury Bay for the high-rolling lifestyle or exorbitant salary. But it does have its compensations.
It makes us sound like we only work for money, which I think if you're a rural GP, you don't. I mean, you work for the satisfaction that you get. A colleague of mine, Andy Minette, said the actual things you remember about this job are the things that you do when you're tired and knackered and you're going to see someone after hours, but you're actually saving their lives from a heart attack or whatever. That's what you remember, and that's what your patients remember you for, and that's your job satisfaction.
Michelle Thompson couldn't agree more. She believes a GP's happy home life is the golden key to smaller communities not only claiming, but keeping them in a place to call home.
Evidence tells us that one of the key things for keeping a rural GP in that rural setting is the happiness of their spouse and their children. And if their spouse is not happy or the children aren't happy, it's very unlikely they're going to stay. So it could be as simple as having a proper welcome for them when they get into the community, keeping them up to date with what's happening with leisure and sporting activities, for the kids for after school, what sort of groups are on, the gardening groups, the tool shed clubs, the reading groups, the theatre groups, things like that, really making them feel connected so they actually want to stay and put down roots.
There is the financial aspect of it. I mean, if you fund rural general practice well, then you will attract more people. But much more than that, there's the social aspect. I mean, a Labour minister who I suppose ought to remain nameless said that, you get your medical graduates down there and you get them to meet proper girls, nice girls, and you get them married and they'll stay there. Well, actually, Minister, we're not actually allowed to marry our patients, but the thought is good. The thought is good. So I mean, basically, you get them to enjoy what they're doing and to realise that this is a good life and it is fun and you're always learning and you're always appreciated and you'll stay. My last medical student I had here said, "Hey, I think I'm going to be a rural GP." And I mean, what greater praise is there than that? He said, "I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it."
Drew Chappell reporting. Coming up, what's next in the Crayfar Farms controversy? Our special interview with Shanghai Pension's New Zealand representative. Welcome back to Sector Report. Well, last week, Justice Forrest Miller dropped a bombshell into the middle of the battle for ownership of the controversial Crayfar dairy farm empire, the battle between foreign bidders Shanghai Pension and the New Zealand bidders in the Crayfar Farm Purchasers Group. The judge found that the Overseas Investment Office and the government ministers who approved the sale to Shanghai Pension had not properly tested the benefits of the transaction to New Zealand. He ruled that those benefits had to be substantial and not simply measured on the difference between the farms in their current rundown state and the likely improvement after a sale to a foreign owner, but on the benefits that the foreign purchaser would deliver compared to any other likely buyer. Right now, the Overseas Investment Office is applying the judge's test and preparing new recommendations for consideration by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Lands Information. But what's the setback doing to Shanghai Pension's interest in investing in New Zealand agribusiness? In our special extended interview, we're out to find out from the company's New Zealand spokesman, Cedric Allen. Cedric, thanks for the time. Let's start with a primary question. What is your exact role in representing the interests of Shanghai Pengjin and its subsidiary Milk New Zealand?
I'm their official spokesman in New Zealand. I have been for a year. I've been working with the group since last December.
Okay, you're not a director of the company?
No, I'm not. I've got no official position with the company.
Well, Milk New Zealand was represented at the review hearings. What was the view of your representatives when the hearing was concluded and they were waiting for the judgment? Were they confident of the outcome?
We were confident.
Yeah.
We were very confident that we had the business acumen and incidentally the farming experience to run these properties in the way we'd promised, particularly as we'd gone into a joint venture arrangement with Landcorp.
So did the judge's decision actually surprise your clients?
It took us by surprise.
Had you seen that as a possibility?
As a vague possibility. We'd heard the arguments in court, of course, so we knew that that was one of the propositions being laid in front of him by the Michael Fay team. We pretty much disregarded it, and we disregarded it on two grounds. The first one was that for 7 years, the Overseas Investment Office has been making its decisions on a very different basis.
You mean we've got to revisit 7 years of foreign land purchasing in New Zealand?
No, apparently we don't have to go back, but this ruling by the judge will certainly affect the way in which all future overseas investment applications are considered in New Zealand.
Can you actually appeal against this decision?
I think there are, but it's a very long-winded, time-consuming process, and there's not a lot of time left with this transaction. It's either going to succeed or not.
Well, now the matter's gone back to the Overseas Investment Commission for further consideration, and it'll go to their recommendation will go to the Minister for approval. In this process, is Shanghai Pengjin going to be presenting further evidence?
We're providing commentary and submissions, and we've been doing that over the last couple of days, yes.
Effectively, will you be upping the ante in terms of the benefits that you'll be delivering?
It's more providing further analysis of the benefits of our proposal, but it won't be changes to our proposal.
Effectively, a foreign purchaser is required to show that the farms would perform better in their hands than would be likely to be the case if they were in the hands of another purchaser. Can you actually do that?
Well, that's correct, but the great difficulty, David, is that you're being asked to compare what you're promising to do and what you will be required to do by the Overseas Investment Office in terms of conditions with a non-existent theoretical New Zealand buyer who is accountable to no one.
Well, except that you do have the model of an existent New Zealand bidder to go by. So is it that hard?
It's not a great model. The problem here is that Alan Crafer, the previous owner, was obviously struggling to pay the bills, had been for quite some time. The farms had not been farmed very well, even though Alan Crafer is clearly a competent farmer and a very hard worker. So there will be argument as to what is the appropriate benchmark. Is the benchmark the milk production being achieved by the receivers at the moment? Is it the milk production being achieved by Alan Crafer in his last year in business? Or is it the production that the farms would theoretically sustain?
Oh, yes, well, I can understand the problem, but shouldn't you go at it on the basis of what is a farmer purchaser likely to do with that property if they acquire it compared to what you can do, and there's the margin of what you can do above that? I mean, that's not that hard, is it?
I think it's a very difficult exercise.
Why?
You've got.
I mean, it's done in other areas of commerce disputes, in mergers and takeovers.
These are exactly the discussions that are taking place at the moment. What is the benchmark, and how do you establish what another farmer might have done, what his motivation might have been? The performance that another farmer achieves from that land depends on the amount of money they've got available and their willingness to spend it. Pengjin has undertaken to spend $14 million in the first 3 years upgrading those farms and to achieve an increase in production of 10% over the figures that were being achieved when the farms went into receivership.
It could be argued that any farmer buying those properties will actually achieve that kind of growth in production, basically because the properties are currently run down.
Well, I don't agree with that, because there are farmers going into receivership all the time in New Zealand. Being a good farmer is not the same thing as being a good businessman. I agree that New Zealand grassland farmers are the best in the world, You'd have to ask yourself, therefore, why receiverships are quite common and why there is widespread concern in New Zealand about the state of indebtedness of New Zealand farmers.
Minister Williamson in Parliament last week said that the Shanghai Pension Group actually has a track record in farming. What exactly is that track record?
Well, Pension has a substantial track record in farming. Going back to 2005, Pension has the controlling interest in a farm of 12,500 hectares, half as big again as these Greyfar farms in Bolivia, where they've been successfully and profitably farming wheat and sorghum, corn, products like that.
And did they lift the level of output and benefit to the country?
Absolutely. And in China, Pension owns its own farms. It's got a series of sheep farms where it's engaged in breeding and increasing the size of the flock. Pension intends to have 3 million sheep within 5 years in China.
So how did it come about that you selected Landcorp as your farm manager?
Because Pension knows little, if anything, about dairy farming. And in coming into...
Isn't that your problem?
Not as far as the Overseas Investment Office is concerned. No, they looked at that and said, we're not concerned about that. We don't require this applicant to have specific, narrow experience in dairy farming.
Is Landcorp a good dairy farmer? Do you know? What's its experience? What's its performance?
Landcorp is one of the most impressive farming organisations in the country. And I'll come back to that point a little later if I may, David, but Landcorp has the farms in our area. Their farms are pepper-potted among ours. So it's a very attractive opportunity.
The ones you seek, you mean?
They're currently ours. We only have to satisfy a condition. We are the only organisation which we own these farms conditionally. We have done a deal
I've got
on price and settlement.
Understand.
Yep. Landcorp will be able to use their existing equipment on our farms. They'll be able to use some of their existing labour on our farms. There are synergies in Landcorp having many more farms to manage in one area than they have now. They're very pleased to do the deal. And let me tell you that Landcorp believe this deal will give them a gross income of $20 million a year just to start with.
At whose instigation was the arrangement with Landcorp made? Was it Landcorp, was it Shanghai Pension, or was it somebody else?
I approached Landcorp to see if they would be interested. They were interested. We've been talking to them for the past 4 or 5 months, and it's been a very harmonious series of discussions. In addition, of course, part of the deal is that we open doors for Landcorp in China, for Landcorp to sell its consultancy services. We will use Landcorp's specialist ability in our sheep farms in China. And bear in mind that Landcorp has substantial production from its farms. It produces wool, lamb, beef, milk. All of those things can be introduced to China as processed product in exactly the same way that Pension intends to process in New Zealand.
Are they a likely partner in any processing development in New Zealand?
Haven't had discussions on that.
Okay. Have you had discussions with any other prospective New Zealand partner?
Yes.
Because there is a condition that says you must be in a partnership with a New Zealand company or New Zealand nationals if you engage in processing in this country.
Indeed there is, and that is something that we sought. Pension does not want to build a standalone processing plant and operate it. It's a wee bit like the dairy experience, David, that Pension actually knows almost nothing about processing dairy products, and we admit that. We need to be in business with a New Zealand-owned processor, and we want to do that by form of a long-term joint venture or other such arrangement. We want to grow that company with ourselves.
Tell me about the downstream processing prospects that would be involved in adding value to that New Zealand farm output.
Yes, well at the moment the milk off those farms goes to Fonterra, and if we succeed in buying them, for the short term it will continue to go to Fonterra. You have to observe that 60% of Fonterra's exports are in the form of milk solids. It's a very low extent of processing. It's a somewhat low value product. What Pension wants to do is to get into the high end of the game, and remember, Pension starts in China. Pension looks at the Chinese market and says all of these high value branded dairy based products.
They're committed to the development of these products?
Absolutely, it's the only reason they're here.
There'll be more from Shanghai Pension's spokesman Cedric Allen in just a moment when we continue our special interview on Sector Report. Welcome back to Sector Report and part 2 of our special interview on the battle for the Crayford Dairy Farm empire with Shanghai Pension's New Zealand spokesman Cedric Allen. Before your actual proposal was tabled with the receiver, were you engaged in lobbying with either government ministers or the Overseas Investment Office here in New Zealand?
To the best of my knowledge, we have done no lobbying whatsoever. We have not run a public campaign.
I didn't ask about a public campaign. I asked about whether you had met with them in the course of the process.
Shanghai Pension is familiar with operating in foreign countries, and they have great respect for the process in New Zealand. Pension's attitude has been, we have made a formal application to a government body. We will sit and wait for the outcome of that body and trust their deliberations.
What was the actual involvement of the Chinese government and particularly the Chinese embassy in New Zealand in this whole process?
I would suggest that the Chinese government and the Chinese embassy and the Chinese business community and the international business community are all watching this transaction with very keen interest. And I can imagine at the moment there is dismay in those quarters where people are saying, we would love to invest in New Zealand, but look at it, you've got to wait for almost a year to get an answer. Within a fortnight of getting it, it'll be subject to a legal challenge. There are many easier disciplines to go and invest in than New Zealand.
Is it correct that Shanghai Pension says in its application for the Crayford Farms that should its bid be turned down, this application would adversely affect New Zealand's free trade agreement with China?
Yes, something to that effect was stated in the application to the overseas investment.
On what basis was that statement made?
Let me put it this way. China is our second biggest trading partner. We have a free trade agreement with China. China is our biggest market for dairy products. Britain, Australia, Canada, America, Israel all own something like 30 to 40,000 hectares of New Zealand farmland. China owns almost no farmland. It owns almost nothing in this country. China should be a significant overseas investor. It's not. The public has sat by and watched the land be bought by Germans, by Swiss, Italians, Australians, as I mentioned before. It's a curious thing, isn't it, that when China wants to buy some farmland, which is 0.006%, I'll say that again, 0.006% of New Zealand's farmland, suddenly it's a national disaster.
I've read the polls. I've seen polls myself. Hadn't you read them? Hadn't they read them? And didn't they understand that there was going to be a hurdle to climb?
Yes, but David, I need to make the point that every country manages the sale of its farmland according to its own wishes. In New Zealand, the New Zealand government encourages foreign investment. It permits the sale of farmland. It has set up the Overseas Investment Office to vet all applications. And there is a legal process to go through where an applicant must demonstrate significant benefit to New Zealand before they're allowed to buy farmland in this country. Make the point that the test for Pension has been far, far higher than for any other purchaser of New Zealand farmland. We have worked with the Overseas Investment Office for the last 9 months, being grilled on our plans, having conditions imposed, being asked to provide verifications of our claims. No other applicant to purchase farmland has had to go through this process.
And you've just discovered that the test will be higher from now on. How do your clients feel about that? Is Shanghai Pension's patience getting exhausted?
No. Chinese are long-term thinkers. They're absolutely committed to purchasing these properties, and as of today they're very confident that the Overseas Investment Office will provide a supportive recommendation and that it will be endorsed by the government.
So what's your opinion about the transparency and fairness of the overseas investment regime here in New Zealand?
I think a lot of people who are watching this process think that the Overseas Investment Act needs to be rewritten and reclarified. And I think that there is some support for the fact that the proceedings of the Overseas Investment Office could be more open than they are. However, we've managed with the Overseas Investment Office the process and the existing legislation without any apparent problems for 7 years.
We'll keep tracking. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Cedric Allen, New Zealand spokesman for Shanghai Pension, the major offshore bidders for the 8,000-acre Crayfar Dairy Farms empire. And that's all for this week. Remember, you can catch this show again anytime online at country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson for Sector Report. See you next week.